The Knights Templar began as men who promised to own nothing. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, renouncing personal wealth in a world obsessed with land, gold, and inheritance. On paper, they were meant to live like monks. In reality, they would soon command resources that rivaled Europe's most powerful kings. This contradiction sits at the heart of the Templar mystery, and it is one historians still struggle to explain. Chroniclers of the 12th and 13th centuries describe Templar fortresses stocked with silver, their stables filled with war horses, and their halls frequented by nobles seeking favors. Kings entrusted them with royal treasuries. Popes granted them privileges denied to any other order. Yet officially, no individual Templar owned so much as a coin. Everything belonged to the order, an abstraction that somehow accumulated wealth while its members claimed spiritual poverty. This paradox unsettles modern logic. How could an organization built on renunciation become Europe's most reliable financial power? Was it merely discipline and trust, or was something more calculated at work? The deeper historians dig, the stranger the picture becomes. Records hint at riches without clearly explaining their source, as if wealth simply flowed toward the Templars. From the very beginning, then, the order carried a quiet tension between appearance and reality. And in that tension lies the first clue that the Knights Templar were never just warrior monks, but architects of something far more dangerous than anyone realized. The Knights Templar did not begin as legends. They started as a small brotherhood patrolling the dusty roads of Jerusalem, protecting pilgrims who were easy prey for bandits. For years, they were little more than a practical solution to a dangerous problem, surviving on donations and goodwill. Nothing about their early mission suggested they would reshape Europe, yet something changed once their reputation spread. Nobles donated land. Kings offered protection. Estates appeared across France, England, Iberia, and the Holy Roman Empire, all tied to a single order headquartered thousands of miles away. While other knightly groups fought for territory, the Templars quietly connected it. Their strength was never in numbers. Even at their peak, they were outnumbered by royal armies. What made them indispensable was reliability. A Templar promise carried weight across borders. Their seal meant safety, discretion, and absolute enforcement. That trust became more valuable than swords. Slowly, pilgrims turned into clients and donations into deposits. Wealth moved through Templar hands not as plunder, but as stewardship. They stood between continents, cultures, and currencies, invisible mediators in a fragmented world. By the time European rulers noticed, the order's influence extended far beyond the Holy Land. From Jerusalem's streets to Europe's thrones, the Templars had risen without conquest. There, true power was already established, quietly, efficiently, and in ways few fully understood, and historians still debate whether this ascent was accidental or the first sign of a financial revolution hiding behind armor, prayer, and unquestioned faith across medieval Europe itself. The deeper historians search for the Knights Templar, the more unsettling the silence becomes. Charters record land grants, chronicles describe battles, papal bulls praise obedience. But when it comes to how the order actually managed its wealth, the trail thins almost to nothing. Accounts vanish, ledgers are missing. Transactions that should have left paper scars across medieval Europe are reduced to vague references and careful omissions. This absence has often been dismissed as medieval disorganization, a time before standardized bookkeeping. Yet that explanation feels increasingly hollow. other institutions left records. Monasteries tracked rents. Kings tracked taxes. Merchants tracked profits. Only the Bassettes, Templars, whose influence spanned kingdoms, seemed to move in shadows. Some surviving documents hint at deliberate restraint. Some are mentioned without sources. Deposits are acknowledged without totals. It is as if scribes knew more than they were permitted to write. Historians are left wondering whether silence itself was part of the system. Secrecy offered protection. In an era where wealth invited violence, discretion was survival. But the scale of the silence suggests more than caution. It suggests design, a method of operating that relied on trust rather than transparency, on memory rather than ink. If so, the missing records are not evidence of absence, but proof of intent. The Templars may have understood that the less people knew about how money moved, the more powerful the system became. And that realization, hidden between blank pages, may be their most radical legacy. History still waits for answers no archive provides. The story of the Knights Templar ultimately bends toward a single, unavoidable question. It is a question that unnerves historians because it refuses a simple answer. What exactly did these warrior monks discover or invent that allowed them to operate above kings, beyond borders, and outside the normal rules of medieval power? They did not conquer territory like empires, nor did they rule populations like monarchs. Their influence spread without banners or battles. Money flowed through their hands smoothly, quietly, and with remarkable trust. That alone suggests something unprecedented. In a violent age built on force, the Templars wielded confidence. Some scholars argue it was merely organization and discipline, nothing more. Others suspect knowledge imported from the East, where mathematics, contracts, and credit were already more advanced. A few go further, proposing that the Templars unlocked a conceptual shift, treating wealth not as metal to be guarded, but as information to be moved. If that is true, then the order's real innovation was invisible. It lived in agreement, symbols, and shared belief. Once people accepted that value could travel without gold, Europe changed forever. And yet, the most troubling part remains. If the Templars created such a system, why did no one fully document it? Why does it surface only in fragments, rumors, and sudden leaps forward in finance? Perhaps the secret was never meant to be written down. Perhaps its power depended on silence. In asking this question, we step beyond knights and crusades and into birth of history. For a medieval pilgrim, the journey to Jerusalem was as much a gamble with death as it was an act of faith. Travelers crossed lawless roads, hostile territories, and seas ruled by pirates. Robbers waited at mountain passes. Corrupt officials demanded bribes, and entire caravans could vanish without record. Carrying gold made survival even less likely. Coins were heavy, obvious, and irresistible to anyone willing to kill. Yet devotion overpowered fear. Tens of thousands attempted the journey each year, many selling land or family heirlooms to finance it. Their wealth traveled with them, sewn into clothes, hidden in packs, or guarded by hired escorts who often fled at the first sign of danger. The road itself became a graveyard of broken faith and stolen fortunes. The Knights Templar emerged directly from this crisis. Their original task was simple: protect pilgrims. Armed, disciplined, and sworn to obedience, they offered something rare: reliability. A Templar escort was feared by bandits and respected by officials, but protection alone could not solve the deeper problem. The true danger was not just violence, but money itself. As long as pilgrims carried their wealth, they remained targets. The journey demanded a solution that removed gold from the road entirely, and somewhere between Jerusalem's gates and Europe's cathedrals, the Templars realized that guarding money was less effective than making it disappear. That realization would quietly change everything. What began as armed protection would evolve into something far more radical, addressing not violence, but value itself. The solution the Templars offered seemed unremarkable at first. A pilgrim could deposit money at a Templar house in Europe and receive a document in return. No chest of coins, no armed convoy, just a piece of parchment bearing symbols, seals, and coded markings. With it, the pilgrim traveled unburdened, carrying nothing worth stealing. Upon reaching the Holy Land, that same document could be presented at another Templar commandery. There, after verification, the pilgrim received the equivalent value. The gold had crossed continents without ever leaving its vault. To medieval eyes, it looked like convenience. In truth, it was a revolution. These letters of credit transformed money into information. Value no longer depended on physical presence. It depended on trust, recognition, and shared rules across vast distances. Historians now recognize this as an early form of banking, but at the time it went largely unnamed. What makes this innovation extraordinary is how seamlessly it worked. There were no public ledgers, no legal systems enforcing repayment. The system relied entirely on the Templars' reputation and internal discipline. Fraud was rare, not because it was impossible, but because the order's authority was absolute. Most people never questioned how it worked. They only knew that it did. And while pilgrims celebrated survival, the Templars quietly proved that wealth could move invisibly, changing Europe's relationship with money forever. Trust was the rarest currency of the medieval world. Kings mistrusted nobles, merchants mistrusted rulers, and peasants trusted no one beyond their village. There were no national banks, no insurance, no legal guarantees protecting deposits. Handing over wealth meant surrendering control entirely, yet people did. Pilgrims, merchants, nobles, even monarchs entrusted their fortunes to the Knights Templar. The reason was not fear, but belief. The Templars answered only to the Pope, placing them beyond local politics. They lived communally, eliminating personal greed, and their vows carried spiritual weight. To steal was not just crime, but damnation. Reputation reinforced belief. The order enforced discipline ruthlessly. A single breach of trust could collapse the entire system, and the Templars understood this better than anyone. Their survival depended on reliability. Over time, this trust scaled upward. What worked for pilgrims worked for merchants. What worked for merchants worked for kings. Royal treasuries were deposited in Templar vaults because they were safer than castles. This was something new, institutional trust without a state. The Templars became a neutral authority in a divided world, trusted not because they ruled, but because they were predictable. In creating that trust, they laid groundwork for modern finance, centuries before governments would claim the role themselves. Every innovation carries a shadow, and the Templar system was no exception. Once money became abstract, power followed. Those who controlled transfers controlled access, and those who controlled access could influence decisions without ever drawing a sword. The Templars now sat at the center of wealth flows across Europe and the Holy Land. They knew who owed whom, who was solvent and who was desperate. In a world where kings depended on credit to wage war, that knowledge was dangerous. Officially, the order served. Unofficially, they possessed leverage unmatched by any army. A delayed transfer could cripple a campaign. A refused deposit could expose weakness. Even silence could be powerful. There is no clear evidence the Templars abused this power, but the possibility alone frightened rulers. Financial influence is invisible, and invisible power is hardest to challenge. Unlike castles, it cannot be besieged. Once money stopped being metal and became agreement, authority shifted. Control no longer belonged solely to those with land or armies, but to those who managed trust itself. By solving a pilgrim's problem, the Templars created a system that could reshape politics. And in doing so, they crossed a line no medieval institution had crossed before. The consequences would come later, violently, when kings realized what they had allowed to grow. To the outside world, a Templar commandery looked unremarkable. Thick stone walls, a chapel, stables, fields worked by tenants. It resembled hundreds of other monastic estates scattered across medieval Europe, but appearances concealed function. These commanderies were not isolated religious houses. They were nodes in a vast, interconnected network from England to Iberia, from France to the Levant. Each commandery was linked by shared rules, codes, and constant communication. Messengers moved along established routes, carrying information far more valuable than letters of devotion, money, instructions, confirmations. What entered one house could reappear in another weeks later, transformed but intact. Behind closed doors, commanderies handled deposits, transfers, and storage. Gold could be accepted in Paris and made available in Acre. Estates produced income that flowed upward through the order, redistributed where needed. Unlike feudal holdings, these properties were coordinated, not independent. Speed was the true innovation. In an age where wealth usually moved at the pace of carts and ships, the Templars made it move at the pace of trust. A promise honored in one house was honored everywhere. This web created resilience. If one commandery fell, others absorbed the shock. No single location held everything. The system was decentralized, deliberate, and difficult to disrupt. What looked like scattered monasteries was, in reality, Europe's first transcontinental financial infrastructure, hidden behind prayer, discipline, and silence. The sophistication of the Templars' financial operations poses a troubling question. How did an order founded by warriors and monks develop systems that resemble modern accounting? Medieval Europe lacked standardized bookkeeping, yet the Templars tracked assets across continents with remarkable consistency. Fragments of evidence suggest internal ledgers existed, carefully maintained within commanderies. Transactions were recorded not for public scrutiny, but for internal balance. Incoming deposits, outgoing payments, obligations owed between houses. These records were functional, not decorative. Audits appear to have been routine. Senior officials traveled between commanderies, inspecting accounts and enforcing discipline. Errors were not tolerated. In a system built on trust, precision was survival. A single discrepancy could unravel confidence. What unsettles us historians is how quickly this sophistication emerged. There is no gradual evolution visible in surviving records. The system appears almost fully formed, as if imported or deliberately designed rather than discovered through trial and error. Some argue, the influence of Islamic financial practices encountered during the Crusades. Others suggest Roman administrative knowledge, preserved and adapted, but no explanation fully satisfies. The Templars did not invent numbers or writing. They invented consistency. In doing so, they created something rare in medieval life, a predictable financial machine operating quietly, efficiently, and far ahead of its time. Gold and silver formed the foundation of medieval wealth, but the Templar system hints at something more abstract. Physical metal could explain deposits and withdrawals, but it cannot fully explain scale. The order moved vast sums without visibly transporting equivalent bullion. This raises an unsettling possibility. The Templars may have operated on credit long before Europe openly understood it. Deposits did not always remain static. Funds could be loaned, reassigned, or promised against future income from estates. Value became flexible. Debt entered the equation. Kings borrowed against future taxes. Nobles pledged land revenue. The Templars managed these obligations, not as isolated favors, but as part of a broader system. Money existed not only as coins, but as expectations. If true, the order was dealing in future value, a dangerous concept in a feudal world anchored to tangible assets. Credit creates growth, but it also creates dependence. Those who manage it gain influence without violence. No surviving document spells this out clearly. The evidence is circumstantial, inferred from gaps, patterns, and sudden financial capacity. Yet the implications are profound. The Templars may have helped Europe take its first steps away from metal-based wealth toward a system built on promises. And once wealth becomes promise, control belongs to those who decide which promises matter, perhaps the most destabilizing aspect of the EOS. Templar system was not wealth, but independence. The order answered to the Pope alone. It paid no taxes to kings, obeyed no local laws, and operated across borders without permission. For medieval rulers, this was unprecedented. Wealth flowed through Templar hands without passing through royal treasuries. A king could borrow from them, but he could not command them. In financial terms, this reversed the traditional hierarchy. Authority followed money, not crowns. At first, rulers welcomed the arrangement. It solved problems, it funded wars, it stabilized fragile states. But dependence breeds resentment. As debts grew, so did unease. Kings began to realize that their power rested partly in an institution they could not control. This was a new kind of rival, not an army to defeat, not a noble to depose, but a system, invisible, distributed, and legally protected. Seizing land could not dismantle it. Killing members would not erase knowledge. For the first time in European history, and organization wielded economic influence on a continental scale without sovereign backing. That imbalance could not last. Conflict was inevitable. When power shifts silently, those who lose it rarely accept the change peacefully. And as the Templars' network expanded, so too did the fear that would eventually destroy them. By the 13th century, an extraordinary reality had taken hold across Europe. Kings no longer trusted their own castles to safeguard royal wealth. Instead, they placed state treasuries in the vaults of the Knights Templar. Coins meant to fund governments, armies, and courts rested behind monastery walls, guarded by men who owned nothing personally. This was not symbolism, it was necessity. Medieval administrations were riddled with corruption. Treasurers fled, officials skimmed, and rivals seized assets during political upheaval. Templar vaults offered stability. Their fortresses were neutral, disciplined, and protected by both military strength and papal authority. France provides the clearest example. The royal treasury of Paris was stored inside the temple complex itself, effectively outsourcing national security to a religious order. England followed similar practices. Monarchs deposited tax revenues in emergency reserves, confident they would remain untouched. This arrangement revealed a quiet admission of weakness. Sovereigns ruled land and people, yet relied on an external institution to protect the very foundation of power, money. The Templars became custodians not just of gold, but of legitimacy. One's wealth sat beyond royal reach. Control subtly shifted. Kings could request funds, but they no longer physically possessed them. Authority became conditional, dependent on access rather than ownership. What began as convenience evolved into reliance, and reliance, once established, has a way of reshaping relationships. The moment kings placed their treasuries in Templar hands, the balance of medieval power quietly began to tilt in ways few yet understood. Wars in medieval Europe were rarely spontaneous. They required preparation, supplies, mercenaries, and time. Above all, they required money. By the 13th century, the Knights Templar had become the silent financiers behind many of these conflicts. Crusades were the most visible example. Funding campaigns to the Holy Land demanded enormous resources. Kings and nobles borrowed heavily, often pledging future revenues or land as collateral. Templar money ensured armies marched, ships sailed, and sieges endured. But crusades were not the only beneficiaries. Civil wars, succession disputes, and regional conflicts also relied on Templar credit. When treasuries ran dry, loans filled the gap. The order rarely dictated causes, but their participation made wars possible. This raises an uncomfortable question. If war requires financing, and financing depends on approval, where does decision-making truly lie? The Templars did not wield swords on battlefields, yet, without their support, many campaigns would have collapsed before they began. Their involvement was discreet. Contracts were private, terms were flexible. Official chronicles credit kings and generals, not creditors. But money has gravity. It shapes outcomes long before armies clash. Over time, rulers learned that access to Templar funds could determine political survival. Victory depended not only on strategy, but solvency. In enabling war, the Templars influenced history indirectly, proving that those who fund violence can shape it as surely as those who fight. Debt changes relationships. A debtor speaks differently to a creditor. Medieval kings were no exception. As loans accumulated, the language of authority softened. Requests replaced commands, negotiations replaced decrees. Owing money made rulers vulnerable. Repayment depended on future taxes, successful harvests, or military victory. Failure meant embarrassment at best, collapse at worst. The Templars knew this, even if they rarely exploited it openly. Debt carried moral weight. Kings who failed to repay risked spiritual condemnation as well as political disgrace. The order's religious status amplified pressure. To default was not merely financial failure, but a sin. Strategically indebted kings faced limits. Funds earmarked for repayment could not support rebellions or reforms. Dependence constrained options. Sovereignty narrowed. What made this power unsettling was its subtlety. The Templars did not issue ultimatums. They waited. Time favored creditors. Interest, fees, and obligations accumulated quietly, tightening influence without confrontation. In this dynamic, the traditional hierarchy inverted. Crowned heads answered indirectly to monks. Authority flowed backward along chains of obligation. Debt transformed kings into clients. And once rulers realized that their independence had been compromised not by invasion but by agreement, anxiety followed. The Templars had not seized power. They had been granted it one loan at a time through necessity disguised as trust. Trust is fragile, and dependence breeds resentment. As royal debts deepened, admiration for the Templars curdled into suspicion. Kings began to question an institution that held their wealth, their obligations, and their secrets. The order's immunity from royal law became intolerable. Their exemption from taxes looked less like privilege and more like provocation. Whispers spread that the Templars were too rich, too powerful, too independent. Fear replaced gratitude. What if the order refused access? What if they sided with rivals? What if their loyalty lay elsewhere? These questions haunted rulers whose authority rested increasingly on borrowed stability. Public perception shifted as well. The sight of poor monks guarding immense wealth unsettled common sense. Rumors flourished. Accusations of greed, corruption, and hidden agendas circulated. Wealth invites scrutiny, and secrecy magnifies it. The irony was brutal. The Templars had solved problems kings could not, yet success made them targets. Creditors are tolerated only until debts feel unbearable. By the early 14th century, some rulers sought escape, not repayment, but elimination. If the system could not be controlled, it could be destroyed. Resentment hardened into resolve. The very qualities that made the Templars indispensable now made them dangerous. And in the minds of desperate kings, danger justified betrayal. The stage was set for a reckoning that would be swift, ruthless, and officially righteous, but driven by fear long suppressed. Accounts from medieval witnesses describe spaces within Templar commanderies that were strictly off limits. Not to pilgrims, not to nobles, in some cases not even to kings. These were rooms sealed by authority rather than iron, protected by obedience and oath. What lay inside was never fully described, only hinted at through frustration and suspicion. Inventories taken after the orders fall mentioned chests without contents, shelves without explanation, and references to records that no longer existed. The absence itself became evidence. In an age when rulers demanded access to everything within their realm, denial was an act of defiance. The Templars claimed necessity. Financial records, they argued, required protection from theft and manipulation, but the degree of secrecy exceeded practical caution. Kings who deposited their wealth were denied the right to inspect how it was managed. Trust was demanded without transparency. Such restrictions suggest that the ledgers were not simple lists of coins. They may have contained knowledge of obligations, credits, and balances spanning continents. To reveal them would expose the entire system. Secrecy was not paranoia. It was structural. The fewer people who understood how money moved, the safer it became. Control depended on obscurity. Locked rooms did more than guard wealth. They guarded understanding. And in those silent chambers, the Templars preserved something rulers could sense but not see. That imbalance fueled fear. When power hides behind closed doors, imagination fills the gap. And imagination, once provoked, rarely ends peacefully. The Knights Templar spoke a language layered with meaning. Official correspondence was restrained, precise, and often vague. Simple phrases carried implications understood only within the order. Outsiders heard devotion. Insiders heard instruction. Witness testimony from later trials mentions symbols, signs, and verbal formulas used to confirm identity and authority. These were not decorative rituals. They functioned as safeguards. In a world without secure communication, secrecy depended on shared knowledge. Some historians suspect early forms of cryptography. Not complex ciphers by modern standards, but deliberate ambiguity. Numbers replaced names. Locations implied rather than stated. Transactions disguised as spiritual language. The system hid in plain sight. More powerful than codes were oaths. Templars swore silence under a penalty of spiritual and physical ruin. Betrayal was unthinkable. The order's cohesion depended on obedience that extended beyond death. This internal culture created information asymmetry. Knowledge concentrated at the top, distributed only when necessary. Even within the order, understanding was compartmentalized. Such discipline allowed financial operations to function without written exposure. Memory replaced ink. Trust replaced verification. For medieval rulers accustomed to visibility as control, this opacity was alarming. Power they could not read, they could not command, and in that unreadable silence, the Templars protected more than money. They protected a system that functioned precisely because it was never fully explained. During the Crusades, Europe encountered a world more mathematically and administratively advanced than itself. Islamic scholars had preserved and expanded ancient knowledge of numbers, accounting, and contracts. The Templars lived at the crossroads of this exchange. Stationed in the Levant for generations, they interacted daily with cultures that understood credit, bills of exchange, and complex trade networks. Markets functioned without physical coin transfers. Value moved through agreement and calculation. It's difficult to believe the Templars remained ignorant of this. Their financial sophistication suggests exposure, adaptation, and selective adoption. They did not simply guard pilgrims. They observed systems that worked. Europe at the time was not ready. Usury laws, limited numeracy, and feudal rigidity resisted abstraction, but the Templars operated outside those constraints. Protected by papal authority, they could experiment quietly. Some historians argue this knowledge explains the sudden appearance of advanced accounting within the order. Not invention, but transmission. Not theft, but learning. If true, the Templars acted as conduits, importing ideas before Europe had language for them that made their system seem unnatural, even threatening. Knowledge ahead of its time often looks like sorcery to those unprepared. And in medieval Europe, understanding money without metal bordered on heresy. The Templars may have known this, which would explain why they shared results, not methods. They let Europe use the system while shielding the knowledge that powered it. By the early 14th century, rumors had outpaced facts. The Templars were accused of hiding treasure, worshiping idols, corrupting doctrine. But beneath these charges lay a deeper anxiety. It was not what they possessed, but what they understood. Money had changed meaning under their control. It no longer required presence. It obeyed rules unseen. Authority followed systems rather than swords. This was destabilizing. Kings could tolerate wealth. They could seize it. They could tax it, but they could not tolerate a framework that diminished their relevance. The Templars offered an alternative source of stability, one not tied to bloodlines or borders. The secrecy protected more than accounts. It protected a philosophy. That power could be organized, distributed, and maintained without force. That trust could replace fear. That institutions could outlast rulers. This understanding threatened the medieval order. If accepted widely, it would weaken feudal authority itself. So the line was drawn. The Templars could manage money, but not redefine power. They could serve kings, but not rival them. What the order hid was not merely gold. It was a model of control that made crowns negotiable. Once that realization took hold, secrecy became guilt in the eyes of rulers. Silence became proof. And the knowledge that once made the Templars indispensable now marked them as dangerous. The line had been crossed, and history would soon respond, not with debate, but with fire, chains, and confession. By the turn of the 14th century, Philip IV of France ruled a powerful kingdom with a fragile foundation. His ambitions were vast, but his treasury was not. Years of war with England, conflict in Flanders, and costly administration had drained royal finances. Taxes were stretched to their limits. Coinage had been debased. Discontent simmered. And still the crown owed enormous sums. Much of that debt was owed to the Knights Templar. Philip had relied on their loans, their vaults, and their logistical support. The temple in Paris even housed the French royal treasury itself, a humiliating reminder that the king's wealth rested beyond his personal control. This dependence gnawed at Philip. He was a ruler who believed authority must be absolute. Yet here stood an institution immune to his laws, richer than his crown, and holding his obligations in quiet order. Repayment seemed impossible. Default would be disgraceful. Seizure, unlawful. Philip had precedent. He had expelled Jews from France and confiscated their property. He had crushed the Lombards. Financial enemies were removed, not negotiated with. The Templars, however, were protected by the Church, admired by the public, and deeply embedded in Europe's financial system. But desperation reshapes morality. Philip's solution would not be economic. It would be legal, religious, and violent. If the debt could not be erased honestly, it could be erased by destroying the creditor. Thus, empty coffers became motivation. Financial weakness transformed into calculated resolve. The king did not merely turn against the Templars out of greed. He did so out of necessity, pride, and fear. And once the decision was made, betrayal became policy. On the morning of Friday, October 13, 1307, France awoke to a coordinated act of precision rarely seen in medieval governance. At dawn, royal agents moved simultaneously across the kingdom. In cities, villages, and remote commanderies, Knights Templar were seized without warning. The scale was astonishing. Hundreds were arrested in a single day. No resistance, no escape. The secrecy required months of preparation. Orders had been sealed, delivered, and timed with meticulous care. Even many royal officials were unaware until the moment arrived. Such coordination reveals intent. This was not a reaction, it was a plan. Philip had studied the order, mapped its locations, and chosen the moment carefully. The Templar strength organization was used against them. The symbolism of the date lingered. Friday, a day of execution. The 13th, long associated with misfortune. Whether deliberate or coincidental, history would remember it. The Templars were stunned. Protected for generations by papal authority, they had believed themselves untouchable. That belief collapsed in hours. Vaults were sealed, records seized, brothers chained. The speed of the arrests prevented communication between commanderies. No warnings traveled, no defenses formed. The network that once moved money effortlessly could not move information fast enough. In one morning, the order fell silent, and in that silence, Philip seized control of the narrative, framing the arrests not as financial seizure, but as moral cleansing. The betrayal was complete before the world understood what had happened. Once imprisoned, the Knights Templar faced accusations designed to shock and isolate. Heresy, idol worship, denial of Christ, obscene rituals, financial corruption, charges so severe they ensured public revulsion. Under torture, many confessed. Pain breaks conviction faster than argument. Medieval justice equated confession with truth, regardless of method. Philip understood this well. The spectacle mattered more than accuracy. Confessions varied wildly. Some contradicted others. Some recanted when torture stopped. Yet they were recorded as fact. Truth became flexible. Guilt became assumed. The nature of the accusations raises suspicion. Financial crimes were obscured beneath religious outrage. Idol worship diverted attention. Heresy justified confiscation. The trial shifted focus away from debt and toward damnation. Pope Clement XII hesitated. Privately, he doubted the charges. Publicly, he wavered under pressure. Philip controlled witnesses, prisons, and public opinion. The church followed reluctantly. Historians now largely agree the accusations were fabricated or exaggerated. No physical evidence supported claims of heresy. The rituals described matched no known practice. The confessions emerged only after torture, yet the damage was irreversible. Reputation collapsed. Allies withdrew. Silence followed. The trials served their purpose. By criminalizing the order morally, Philip justified its destruction legally. The financial motive vanished behind smoke and scripture. What mattered was not whether the Templars were guilty. It was that they were vulnerable, and vulnerability, once exposed, invites annihilation. When royal investigators finally examined Templar holdings, they expected abundance. Vaults bursting with gold, chests overflowing, proof that would validate the accusations and replenish the crown. Instead, they found absence. Inventories listed modest sums. Properties remained, but liquid wealth was largely gone. The great treasure whispered about for decades had vanished. Seals were broken. Rooms were empty. This absence deepened the mystery. Had the Templars moved their wealth before the arrests? If so, how? The speed and coordination of the arrests should have prevented escape. Yet evidence suggests otherwise. Some accounts mention ships leaving French ports days earlier. Others suggest wealth had been distributed gradually, hidden within the system itself. Money transformed into obligations, land, or promises beyond easy seizure. Portugal and Scotland became rumored refugees. In Portugal, the order was rebranded rather than destroyed. In Scotland, royal authority was weak and sympathy lingered. It is also possible that much of the wealth was never physical. Credits, debts, and accounts cannot be seized like coins. Destroying the order did not destroy the system. Philip seized lands and buildings, but the financial engine he feared may have already moved beyond his reach. The missing money became legend, fueling centuries of speculation. Treasure hunts replaced audits. Myths replaced answers. But the true disappearance was not gold, it was control. In breaking the order, Philip eliminated his creditor. Yet the ideas the Templars built, the abstraction of wealth, the power of trust, escaped confiscation. And those ideas would quietly survive him. When officials finally gained access to the Templar vaults, expectations collapsed into confusion. These were supposed to be the repositories of Europe's hidden wealth, the hoards that justified arrests, torture, and dissolution. Instead, investigators found bare rooms, modest sums, and inventories that felt almost deliberately disappointing. Broken seals revealed nothing worthy of legend. Royal accountants recorded what they saw and what they did not. Gold was present, but not in quantities matching the order's reputation. Silver appeared, but not enough to explain decades of financial dominance. The absence was impossible to ignore. Either the wealth never existed as imagined, or it had already vanished. This gap ignited one of history's most enduring mysteries. How could an organization that financed kings leave behind so little? The discrepancy suggested that the true fortune was never stored in vaults alone. Money may have been converted, distributed, or transformed into forms that inventories could not capture. Some historians argue that rumors inflated expectations beyond reality. Others believe the Templars anticipated their fate and acted accordingly. The broken seals hinted at haste. The empty spaces suggested foresight. What remained was suspicion. Confiscation failed to satisfy. Seizure failed to empower. The king gained property, but not answers. The missing wealth became a narrative problem for authorities. To justify destruction, treasure was expected. Its absence undermined certainty and fueled doubt, and in the doubt, imagination flourished. The emptiness of the vaults did more than frustrate investigators. It ensured that the story would never truly end. Almost immediately after the arrests, whispers began to circulate, not in courts, but in ports. Sailors spoke of ships leaving La Rochelle under cover of night, days before the crackdown. Templar vessels, long used to supply the Holy Land, vanished from French harbors without record. La Rochelle was no ordinary port. It was the Order's primary Atlantic base, fortified and well supplied. If wealth were to be moved quickly, this was where it would begin. The timing, if true, was uncanny. No official logs confirmed the departures, but absence is not denial. Medieval maritime records were inconsistent, and secrecy was easy to maintain. Ships could sail without attracting attention, especially when crewed by disciplined men accustomed to silence. Destinations became speculation. Portugal, friendly to the Order; Scotland, distant and unstable; even further west into waters poorly mapped. Each theory added drama, none added proof. What matters is plausibility. The Templars controlled ships, they had motive, and they understood timing. If arrests were anticipated, sea routes offered escape, where roads did not. Whether treasure sailed away or not, the image endured. Ships slipping into darkness, carrying more than cargo, carrying answers. Legend filled the gaps left by documents, and once legend takes hold, it often becomes more powerful than fact. Not all kingdoms followed France's example. Portugal refused to destroy the Templars outright. Instead, the order was dissolved and reborn under a new name, inheriting lands, personnel, and likely knowledge. Continuity replaced rupture. Scotland offered a different refuge, weakened royal authority and ongoing conflict with England created space where enforcement was uneven. Some Templars may have vanished into this instability, their identities lost, but their skills preserved. Switzerland enters the story more subtly. Its later rise as a neutral financial center has fueled speculation, though evidence remains circumstantial. Yet the pattern is suggestive. Stability, neutrality, and trust reappear. What these regions share is tolerance. They allowed structures to persist under altered forms. The order's name vanished, but its practices may not have. If wealth had been transformed into systems rather than stored as metal, survival required people, not vaults, account keepers, administrators, men trained to manage trust. Successors need not wear crosses. They need only remember methods. History rarely destroys knowledge completely. It disperses it. What cannot survive openly adapts quietly. The idea that Templar wealth simply vanished ignores how institutions evolve. It may have migrated, embedded in new organizations, stripped of symbolism, but rich in function. The refuge was not a place. It was continuity. The destruction of the Knights Templar was dramatic, public, and violent, but systems do not die the way people do. They dissolve, fragment, and reassemble. The question is not whether the order fell, but whether its ideas did. Within decades, banking families rose in Italy. Credit expanded. International transfers normalized. Institutions emerged that mirrored Templar practices without sharing their fate. This could be coincidence or inheritance. The absence of clear lineage frustrates historians, but influence does not require documentation. It requires adoption. A good idea spreads because it works. The Templars demonstrated that trust could be centralized, that money could move without metal, that authority could rest on reliability rather than force. These concepts did not vanish in 1307. What disappeared was the symbol, the cross, the habit, the name. What remained was function. Perhaps the order's greatest achievement was invisibility. By the time it was destroyed, its innovations were already embedded in Europe's future. Kings could burn men, but not ideas. If the system survived, it did so quietly, stripped of religious protection and myth, reborn as commerce rather than crusade. The irony is sharp. The Templars were eliminated to restore control, yet in doing so, rulers accelerated the spread of the very financial logic they feared. The order fell. The system endured. When modern observers look back at Templar practices, the resemblance to contemporary banking is unsettling. Deposits were accepted and recorded. Withdrawals were authorized at distant locations. Transfers occurred across borders without the physical movement of wealth. These are not vague similarities. They are functional parallels. In the medieval world, such concepts should not have existed. Money was meant to be seen, weighed, and guarded. Value was tangible. Yet the Templars treated wealth as something that could be represented, promised, and relocated through agreement. They operated with an understanding that feels anachronistic. What makes this remarkable is not that these ideas existed elsewhere in fragments, but that the Templars unified them into a working system. Their operations were standardized across regions. Rules applied equally in France and the Holy Land. Consistency replaced improvisation. To contemporaries, this reliability felt miraculous. To historians, it feels premature. Europe would not formally develop banking institutions for centuries. And yet, here was a religious order behaving like one. The familiarity invites discomfort. If the blueprint existed so early, why did it vanish from memory? Or did it? Perhaps modern banking was not born in Renaissance counting houses, but inherited from an older, quieter experiment. One conducted by men who cloaked innovation in faith and obedience. The Templars did not advertise their methods. They normalized them, and once normalized, ideas tend to persist, even when their origin is forgotten. After the fall of the Templars, Europe did not abandon finance. It accelerated. In the centuries that followed, Italian merchant families rose to prominence. Names like the Medici became synonymous with banking, credit, and international trade. Florence, Venice, and Genoa developed systems strikingly similar to what the Templars had practiced. Letters of credit, branch networks, trusted intermediaries. Financial reputation mattered more than physical reserves. Historians debate whether this was independent development or inheritance. There is no document tracing a direct handover, but absence of proof is not proof of absence. Knowledge rarely transfers through ceremony. It migrates through people. Former Templars did not all vanish. Some entered other orders. Some returned to secular life. Others likely found employment where their skills were valuable. Managing accounts, evaluating risk, coordinating distant operations. These were not common abilities. Merchant families needed expertise. They needed systems that worked. They needed trust. It is plausible that Templar methods, stripped of religious framing, found new expression in private commerce. What had been protected by papal authority now relied on contracts and reputation. If so, the transformation was subtle. Sacred obligation became profit motive. Monastic discipline became corporate governance. The system survived by changing its face, and in doing so, it lost its myth but kept its function. The monks disappeared. The merchants remained. As banking matured, states began to change. Power no longer rested solely on land or armies, but on access to credit. Wars were funded not by hoarded gold, but by borrowed futures. Governments learned to operate in deficit. This shift altered geopolitics permanently. States with strong credit could act beyond their immediate resources. Those without it fell behind. Finance became strategy. The Templars had demonstrated this logic early. They financed campaigns long before centralized treasuries could support them. Later states institutionalized the practice. Debt became normalized. Bonds replaced tribute. Trust became policy. This transition redefined sovereignty. A state's strength depended on confidence as much as coercion. Reputation mattered. Stability attracted lenders. Disorder repelled them. Modern financial states emerged not through conquest alone, but through credibility. The invisible architecture of finance became as important as walls and armies. The irony is striking. The very system that made the Templars indispensable later empowered states to dominate finance themselves. What was once external became internal, yet the foundation remained the same: abstract value, deferred payment, institutional trust. The Templars did not create modern states, but they foreshadowed how states would function. And in that foreshadowing lies their lasting influence on how power is exercised today. Modern finance presents itself as innovation, algorithms, markets, digital transfers. Yet beneath the technology lies a familiar logic. Trust replaces metal, systems replace individuals, promises circulate as value. Seen through this lens, the Templars feel less like anomalies and more like predecessors. Their practices appear not revolutionary but foundational. The absence of explicit lineage allows dismissal. But continuity does not require acknowledgement. It requires effectiveness. Ideas survive because they solve problems. The Templars solved distance. They solved risk. They solved trust in a fragmented world. Modern banking solves the same problems at greater scale. What has changed is visibility. Today, finance is public, regulated, analyzed. In the medieval world, it hid behind walls and vows. But functionally, the skeleton remains. This realization unsettles the narrative of progress. It suggests that modern systems may be refinements, not inventions, that the future borrowed heavily from the past. The Templars were erased as a warning. Their secrecy condemned them. Modern finance embraced openness, yet retained opacity in other forms. The legacy is hidden not because it is secret, but because it is normalized. We do not question what feels inevitable, but history reminds us that inevitability is often constructed, and sometimes it is constructed by those history later chooses to destroy, while quietly preserving what they built. Long after the Knights Templar vanished from history's official record, their symbols refused to disappear. The red cross, once stitched onto white mantles, continued to surface in unexpected places. It appeared carved into stone buildings tied to commerce, etched into seals, and embedded in iconography linked to finance and authority. Whether coincidence or continuity, the repetition unsettles. Symbols endure because they carry memory. For the Templars, the cross was not only religious, it was administrative. It marked property, validated documents, and signaled trust. Where the symbol appeared, legitimacy followed. As banking expanded in later centuries, architecture echoed this language. Vaults resembled fortresses. Ledgers replaced relics. Financial institutions adopted visual cues of stability, discipline, and moral order. The resemblance to monastic imagery is difficult to ignore. Some argue symbolism is universal, that crosses and stones signify permanence everywhere. Yet the persistence of Templar-associated motifs in places of finance raises questions. Were these aesthetic choices or unconscious inheritance? Secret societies later embraced similar imagery. blending sacred and economic symbolism. Whether this reflects lineage or romantic appropriation remains debated, but the attraction is telling. Money requires belief. Symbols reinforce belief. The Templars understood this early. Their authority rested as much on perception as practice. If modern finance still borrows visual language rooted in that era, it suggests that trust remains ritualized. We may no longer kneel before altars, but we still respond to symbols of order. And perhaps, without realizing it, we continue to recognize echoes of a vanished order every time we place faith in institutions we cannot fully see. Few subjects ignite speculation like the Freemasons. Emerging centuries after the Templars' destruction, they presented themselves as keepers of ancient knowledge, builders of systems, guardians of secrets. Naturally, comparisons followed. Legends claim the Freemasons preserved Templar teachings, sheltering survivors and passing down methods disguised as ritual. No definitive proof exists, yet the parallels provoke curiosity. Hierarchical structure, initiations, emphasis on secrecy and trust, symbolic language layered with meaning. Historians remain divided. Some dismiss the connections as myth-making by later groups seeking legitimacy. Others argue that while direct lineage is unlikely, ideological inheritance is plausible. Ideas outlive institutions. The Freemasons flourished during the rise of modern finance. Their networks spanned borders. Members often occupied positions of economic and political influence. Trust within the group facilitated cooperation beyond national boundaries. This does not require conspiracy to be significant. Networks based on shared values naturally amplify opportunity. The Templars demonstrated this centuries earlier. Whether or not Freemasons inherited Templar knowledge directly, they operated in a world shaped by Templar precedent, institutional trust, symbolic authority, invisible coordination. The discomfort lies not in secret meetings, but in continuity. When systems work, they are imitated. When they are destroyed, their logic often survives underground. The Freemasons may not be Templars reborn, but they reflect the same enduring question. Who remembers the rules when the founders are gone? For centuries, treasure hunters have chased rumors of Templar gold. Maps have been drawn, caves searched, ships imagined. Yet no definitive hoard has ever emerged, perhaps because it never existed in the way people expect. Gold is tangible, it satisfies imagination, but systems are harder to see. The Templars' true wealth may have been procedural rather than material. Techniques of trust, coordination, and abstraction. They demonstrated how power could be created without possession, how value could move without weight, how authority could exist without crowns. That knowledge is far more durable than coin. A chest of gold can be seized. A method cannot. It replicates, it adapts, it embeds itself into new contexts. If the Templars hid anything, it was not treasure beneath stone floors. It was understanding within people. Account keepers, administrators, thinkers who carried methods forward consciously or not. This reframes the mystery. The obsession with missing gold distracts from missing documentation, from missing explanations, from the missing acknowledgement that Europe learned something fundamental before it was ready to admit it. The greatest treasure is often invisible because it is everywhere. We do not search for it because we assume it has always existed. If the Templars left a legacy, it was not something to be found. It was something to be used. And that usage continues unnoticed every day. The Knights Templar should be a closed chapter. their order dissolved, their leaders executed, their name condemned, yet fascination persists. This endurance stems from imbalance. The punishment exceeded the proof. The silence exceeded the explanation. Where certainty fails, curiosity thrives. The records are incomplete. The motivations feel layered. Financial, political, religious forces collided. No single cause satisfies. The lack of closure invites reinterpretation. Modern audiences recognize familiar patterns, institutions collapsing under accusations, wealth hidden behind complexity, power shifting invisibly. These themes resonate because they remain relevant. The Templar story also challenges linear progress. It suggests that sophisticated systems existed earlier than acknowledged, then were suppressed. That history may not be a straight ascent, but a cycle of discovery and erasure. Mysteries endure when they threaten comfort. The idea that modern finance has medieval roots complicates narratives of rational advancement. It implies continuity where we expect rupture. As long as trust governs economies and secrecy surrounds power, the Templars will remain relevant. They sit at the intersection of faith and finance, two forces that still shape the world. The mystery refuses to die because its consequences never ended. We live inside the question the Templars left behind. The Knights Templar never ruled kingdoms. They never crowned emperors. They rarely appear as conquerors in history books. And yet, their influence rivaled that of any medieval power. They redefined power by removing it from territory. Power no longer required land or armies. It required systems that others depended on, control without occupation. This was a radical shift. Feudal authority rested on visible dominance. The Templars exercised invisible influence. They facilitated, enabled, and stabilized. That made them indispensable and unchallengeable. Their power was structural, embedded in routines, reinforced by trust. When people rely on a system daily, that system becomes authority. This model feels modern. Corporations, institutions, networks now wield power without borders. They shape outcomes without overt command. The Templars anticipated this reality. They proved that organizing trust could rival force, that coordination could replace coercion. Rethinking power through this lens alters historical judgment. The Templars were not victims of misunderstanding alone. They were victims of innovation. They crossed from serving power to embodying it. That transition was intolerable to rulers whose authority depended on exclusivity. The lesson is uncomfortable. Power evolves. Those who innovate it often face resistance from those who benefit from older forms. The Templars did not lose power. They demonstrated it too early. Modern civilization runs on promises, salaries paid before profits exist, loans granted against future income, digital numbers representing value without substance. We accept this without question. The Templars helped normalize this mindset. They introduced abstraction into a world anchored in physicality. Value could be trusted without being seen. This shift enabled scale. Economies expanded beyond local exchange. Nations formed around credit. Global trade emerged. But abstraction carries risk. When promises break, systems falter. Crises follow. Confidence collapses. The Templars understood fragility. Their discipline enforced reliability. Modern systems rely on regulation, law, and reputation to do the same. We live inside their experiment. Every transaction assumes trust in institutions we rarely understand. When that trust fails, consequences ripple. The medieval fear of abstraction has returned in new forms. Financial crises echo the same anxiety. Who controls value? The Templars were early architects of this reality. They navigated the tension between faith and function. Their world was smaller. The stakes were personal, but the logic persists. Invisible promises bind us together. They also expose us. Recognizing this lineage forces reflection. The systems we depend on are not neutral. They were designed, adapted, and inherited. And like all inheritances, they carry unresolved questions. The Knights Templar were destroyed because they were perceived as too wealthy, too secretive, too powerful. Their assets were seized, their name erased, their bodies burned. Yet the ideas that made them powerful were not destroyed. They became ubiquitous. Modern banking adopted abstraction, states embraced debt, institutions centralized trust. What was once feared became normalized. The irony is sharp. The order was punished for innovations that later defined civilization. History condemned the pioneers and celebrated the outcome. Philip IV eliminated his creditor, but he could not eliminate credit itself. Others adopted it, expanded it, institutionalized it. The Templars lost everything visible, but invisibility was always their strength. Their execution served as warning. Do not outpace the political order. Do not concentrate invisible power without accountability. Modern institutions learned this lesson. They became regulated, dispersed, and complex. Power was diffused enough to survive. The Templars were singular. That made them vulnerable. Their fate highlights a recurring pattern. Innovation threatens incumbents. Destruction follows. Legacy persists. In trying to erase the Templars, medieval rulers ensured their ideas spread without them. The order died. The logic lived on. That is the final irony, and perhaps the final victory. History records defeat in executions and decrees, but influence obeys different rules. If modern finance descends in part from Templar methods, then their destruction did not end their story. It completed it. Their ideas escaped institutional confinement. They became diffuse, adaptable, anonymous, no longer tied to vows or crosses. In death, the Templars became invisible architects. Their system no longer threatened rulers directly. It reshaped the world quietly. Perhaps this was inevitable. Systems outlive creators. Methods outlast names. The question then becomes unsettling. If the Templars' greatest contribution shaped the modern world, who truly won? They were eliminated as an order, but their understanding of power became universal. No king controls it, no border contains it. We live inside a world built on their logic, rarely questioning its origins. The greatest victory is not survival, it is influence without recognition. If that is the measure, the Templars did not lose. They succeeded beyond imagination. Their execution marked the end of their visibility and not their impact. And in that sense, their secret did not change Europe once. It continues to shape it still.